morning, folks, and welcome to Morning Coffee and a Thought. I hope to do a few more of these as we go on into the new year, but I wanted to end this year with the thought of advocacy. It's easy to be an advocate for your close friends and associates, but much more difficult to be an advocate for those that maybe you didn't invite into your life, or for people you hardly know. I was recently struck by an article by a young woman who had the long-term effects of COVID-19. And during her struggle, she became an advocate for people who she met through circumstance, became aware of through circumstance, and wrote an article about being an advocate for people that aren't that close to you, but whose needs you're very aware of. I had some thoughts about that earlier this year, and they came to me from the biblical text of 2 Samuel chapter 21. In that text, it accounts a story that happened during, and I'm going to say near the end, of the reign of King David. There was a famine that had hit the nation of Israel, and famines were quite common in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. But famines that went on more than a year could be very devastating. Even in a good year of crops, in a calendar year of 365 days, even a good crop would maybe feed you anywhere between 310 to 350 days. So a drought could be very, very devastating. And in the text of 2 Samuel 21, it says that the famine had lasted in the nation of Israel for 3 years. That's enough to almost extinguish an entire nation. In fact, just a few centuries prior to that, the Akkadians had been wiped out of Iraq due to a famine that lasted about the same length of time. And so, after 3 years of this famine, and knowing that his nation was probably on the brink, King David inquires of God as to why this famine is occurring. Of course, in ancient cultures, all weather, both favorable and unfavorable, were attributed to the gods, and Israel was no different in this regard. They believed any favorable or unfavorable weather conditions, especially in a nation that relied so much on agriculture, was the work of the gods. And so David gets priests to inquire of Yahweh as to why this famine is occurring in the nation of Israel. His answer is not one that he probably expected. The answer is it's because of a treatment in their society of a people group called the Gibeonites. And so we want to look back at who exactly were the Gibeonites and how did their mistreatment lead Israel to the brink. Well, we have to go back to Joshua chapter 9. It's 450 years prior to this famine in Israel. And as the Jewish nation is in Canaan conquering, they see one city fall after another. Jericho, Ai, a number of cities, people either killed or moved off the land. And these Gibeonites existed in Canaan before Israel invaded. And seeing their neighbors fall by the wayside, they decided that maybe they should go at this with a little different tact. And so what they did is they sent representatives to Israel, telling them they had come from a faraway land, and they had moldy food, and they dressed in old worn-out clothes, trying to seek a treaty with the nation of Israel. And so the leadership, Joshua and the leadership, fell for the deception and made a treaty with them, only to find out a little while later that they had made a treaty with people who just were a few miles up the road from where the invading army was. And so the Gibeonites became part of Israelite society through trickery. And they were kind of second-class citizens after the treaty was made. And this was the case for over 450 years. But things grew on a much darker scale after Saul received the kingship in Israel. All of a sudden, it was more than just they were second-class citizens. Saul began a policy of extermination. Entire Gibeonite families were wiped out. And this policy continued throughout the reign of Saul, and throughout the 450 years, including the reign of Saul, nobody seemed to speak up for this people group. And I think a lot of it was because historically, Israel had seen them as becoming part of society through trickery. They were kind of unwanted friends, people that would be classed as not your favorite people. And so no one in all these years ever spoke up for them, including when things got really dark during the reign of Saul. And so David is now king, Saul has been killed, and still no remedy has been sought for the atrocities inflicted upon the Gibeonites. No one has spoken up for them, no one has advocated for them, no one has sought healing for them or a remedy for them, for all the atrocities and the treatment that had gone on for this 450 years. And finally, we have this famine where the nation itself is brought to the brink. And now the Lord makes it very apparent as to why this is going on, because no one in all these years has advocated for this people group. And I was thinking about this in the last few days, about how easy it is to be an advocate for people who we really invite into our lives, people who are good friends. We'd do anything for them. But it's a much different story for people who may come into our life due to either circumstance or we meet in the workplace. They're not people we really invited into our lives. They're people who have just come in, maybe even barged into our lives. But these people also have needs. And sometimes it's easier for us because we're not close to them or they're not our best friends. They're not people we connect with easily, to kind of overlook their needs. And today I just want to leave with you as people of the Lord Jesus Christ. We are called to people, both friends and those maybe we don't consider them friends, but they're people who have entered our lives through some circumstance, and we've come to know them, we've come to be aware of them, and we really do know what their wants, desires, and their needs are. And sometimes we have to think about the fact that even though they're not our best friends, they're not people we would have invited in, yet sometimes we're called to advocate for these people. Sometimes we're called to advocate for people that we wouldn't normally do that for, but their needs or their wants are put in front of us by God. And those are the times when we have to reach out and meet and advocate for the needs of those that we normally would not. And so I want to leave that thought with you today, is that as we come into the new year, and I'm sure that I will speak more to this in the new year, as believers in Jesus the Messiah, we have to have our eyes open, our ears open, and sometimes put aside how we may feel about a certain person or a situation. And when those needs are brought before us, when their situation is brought before us, that's the time that we need to stand up and be an advocate. We don't want the Lord to try and take the hammer to us as he did to King David and the nation of Israel, because we simply walk away from the needs of other people that surround us. And so I want to leave you with that thought today, to be an advocate. Keep your eyes open. Keep your ears attuned to the needs of people you normally would not be accustomed to either associating with normally or having a lot to do with. People all around us have needs. We just need ears to listen and eyes to be open to what they're saying and what we're seeing. Have a good morning, and we'll talk to you later.